Good evening or good afternoon. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center. We have a wonderful program for you today on Central Asia. First, we will have Ambassador Javlan Vahabov of Uzbekistan, a dynamic young ambassador who's been here for well over a year, representing a changing and dynamic Uzbekistan. And then we'll have a panel, which we'll discuss in a minute. But first, you can read about the ambassador in the speakers' bios. I like to go directly to the event because we have more time to talk. But you can follow us at AC Eurasia, hashtag AC Eurasia. Thank you. Ambassador, please.
So, dear Ambassador Herbst, Dr. Cohen, Ms. Puma, and Ambassador Holland, all guests, ladies and gentlemen. So, thank you very much for a kind introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this important event featuring a key aspect of Central Asian countries' development goals. So, first of all, I'd like to share with my own thoughts with regard to the report that has been recently released, Future Calling Infrastructure Development in Central Asia. Indeed, this report is a very comprehensive and thorough one. The report itself specifies a number of areas for potential investment, namely energy and transport, and makes specific emphasis on China's One Belt, One Road as a sole biggest source of capital for these reasons. So, as you may know, Uzbekistan was one of the first countries back in 2014 which expressed support for the One Belt, One Road initiative based on the understanding that efforts on development of transport communications meet its national interest. So, moreover, today, as you are well aware, the situation in Central Asia, where Belt and Road initiative is being implemented, is fundamentally different from what it used to be just a couple of years ago. So, in this regard, I should say that the report that has been published a few months ago is timely and practically significant. So, again, my congratulations to Dr. Cohen, to Mr. Grant, and all those who took part in editing this report. In the meantime, I now realize why I was invited as a keynote speaker to today's event. As the information on Uzbekistan, in my view, could have been expanded significantly in this report. So that is exactly what I'm going to do for the upcoming 10-15 minutes, as it was scheduled by Ambassador Herbst. So, on a serious note, indeed, Uzbekistan's leadership pays a great deal of attention to the implementation of strategically important projects on transport and communication infrastructure of Uzbekistan as well as Central Asia. The Uzbek government singled out the task of forming reliable transport, including transit, corridors for the delivery of Uzbekistan's foreign trade goods to the largest markets of the world and the region itself. So I'd like to start with our transport strategy. So according to the 5-year program to improve Uzbekistan's transport infrastructure and deliver foreign trade routes of cargo program, adopted more than 1 year ago, government of Uzbekistan put forward ambitious goals and implementing initiatives on the construction of several international transport corridors. And among them are Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Oman transport corridor. The second, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, China. The third, the Trans-Afghanistan Transport Road, which open access to the nearest seaports in the south. So in particular, in March 2017, an important section of the Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Oman transport of communication corridor was launched. the Turkmenabad-Faryab railway and road bridge across Amudarya River were opened, more than doubling the volume of cargo transportation. So moreover, the opening increased the opportunity to promote the idea of creating through transport and communication highway along the Uzbekistan-Turkmenistan-Caspian Sea South Caucasus Road with access to the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway and Black Sea ports of Georgia, Turkey, Romania, and other states. So additionally, after 20 years of negotiations, significant progress has been made on the construction of a railway linking China and Central Asia through Kyrgyzstan. During a tripartite meeting of delegations from China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan that was held last year in December, so practical decisions were made aimed at forthcoming implementation of the Uzbekistan-Kyrgyzstan-China railway project, and with three parties have agreed to finalize all issues related to drafting feasibility study, financing, and road identification. Even with regard to gauge and many other issues are supposed to be finalized by the end of this year. So this corridor will make it possible to transport goods by a shorter route from China via Central Asia to the countries of South Asia and the Middle East, and through the Trans-Caucasian corridor to Europe. According to the preliminary parameters of the project, the delivery time of cargo will be reduced by 7 to 8 days, and the length of the route from East Asia to the countries of the Middle East and Southern Europe shortened by almost 900 kilometers. So the agreement on the construction of the Mazari-Sharif-Herat railway. And today, unfortunately, we are not able to demonstrate my presentation on the screen, but I believe so my colleagues have already distributed these papers here in this room. So, this deal, deal on the construction of the railroad Mazar Herat was reached during the milestone visit of the President of Afghanistan, Mr. Ashraf Ghani, to Uzbekistan last year. And the railway is a continuation of the existing Hayratan-Mazar-Sharif rail line, which was, by the way, constructed by Uzbekistan. And about half of Afghanistan's import and significant volume of humanitarian supplies are imported along this road. So the implementation of this project, the Mazar-Herat railway, will make a real contribution to international efforts for the socio-economic reconstruction of Afghanistan. The implementation of the project will provide jobs for more than 30,000 Afghans and annually bring about $40 million in income. And these estimates belongs not to Uzbek ambassadors. These estimates were released by Asian Development Bank. So due to the formation of its own sources of income from the increase in goods turnover and transit, Kabul will be able to reduce its acute dependence on foreign aid. So, and here it should be also noted that the total cost of the Mazar-Sharif-Herat railway project is about $2 billion, and with accuracy of $1.8 billion, and about $500 million will be allocated by Uzbekistan. The rest part is supposed to be financed by leading international financial institutions. So the implementation of the project will open, of course, a new stage in achieving regional consensus between the countries involved in the Afghan peace process by creating objective conditions for cooperation rather than competition. all of Afghanistan's neighbors and regional partners, primarily India, Iran, and Pakistan, would benefit economically from the construction of the Mazar Sharif Herat Railway. The construction of this railway will allow the transportation of goods in the direction of Central Asia, Pakistan, through the joint Iranian-Pakistan railway network, Zahedan, Quetta, Karachi. At present, the Pakistani side is actively promoting the construction of the Peshawar-Jalalabad railway, which will subsequently connect to a single Afghan railway line and open a direct connection with the Pakistan port of Karachi that fully meets to Uzbekistan's national interests. According to the Minister of Railway of Pakistan, the World Bank is interested in executing a new railway road between Peshawar and Jalalabad, which will go through the Lao Shalman Valley. So here I would also like to disclose some details with regard to Uzbek-American political contacts. So just the day before yesterday, Ambassador Halilzad left for the region. And during his trip, we expect he will pay a working visit to Uzbekistan for the first time after his appointment. And we believe that these issues, even those related to the railway and along with other efforts, by the Uzbek government on a reconciliation process in Afghanistan, will be on the top of the talks between the president of Uzbekistan and Ambassador Halilzad. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, Uzbekistan, as you may know, is the largest electricity producer in Central Asia. Total installed capacity of Uzbekistan's power plants exceeds 12.4 gigawatt, 12 thermal power plants with a combined capacity of over 10.7 gigawatt and 31 hydropower plants with a combined capacity of 1.7 gigawatts today are operating in Uzbekistan, and all these facilities belong to the Uzbek government and relevant state-owned agencies. So why I'm telling about that? Another project also where Uzbekistan is deeply engaged is also related to neighboring Afghanistan. So, the construction of the power transmission line Surkan-Puli-Kumri with a capacity of almost 500 kilowatts. Also, you may see all details in those papers that we've distributed today. So the length of this transmission line is about 300 kilometers. The project will increase the supply of electricity from Uzbekistan to Afghanistan by 70%, up to 6 billion kilowatt hour per year. So, and the estimated amount of the project is about 150 million, of which $32 million will be covered by the Uzbek government. The construction of Surkan-Puli-Kumri transmission line on Afghan territory began in June this year, and its expected implementation period is 3 years, and the payback period, we expect it will take almost 12 years. So let me stop here. As a conclusion, I would like to underscore that infrastructure development via massive investments is key priority for Uzbekistan, and the door of opportunity for such cooperation is wide open. So if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them. Ambassador, once again, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you.
So we are now going to have a conversation about overall what's happening in Central Asia, as well as commenting on the infrastructure report. And we thank again Ambassador Vahaba for gracing us with a wonderful presentation. Our speakers are Ariel Cohn, who's been a noted commentator on first the Soviet Union and the whole post-Soviet space for well over 30 years. We have Katulis Elmer, who's the co-founder and partner of Envoy and a former counselor to the Prime Minister of Kazakhstan for 8 years. We have Ambassador Richard Hoagland, an old colleague of mine working on Central Asia issues in the aftermath of 9/11, and Ms. Emilia Puma, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia, relatively newly minted and a long-term information officer in the State Department. Ariel, we'll turn it over to you to provide some perspective on where Central Asia is and how the infrastructure project fits in.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the International Tax and Investment Center for sponsoring this research. That is iticorg.net on the web. The 25 years of Central Asian development saw at least one war in Tajikistan, several transitions, including in Turkmenistan and in Uzbekistan, a couple of colored revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, and a lot of stability in a place like Kazakhstan. But the trend is unmistakable. The trend is for the environment to become more and more business and investment friendly. I would argue that some countries are ahead and some countries are behind. And for the populations of the 5 post-Soviet Central Asian countries and Afghanistan to develop their economies, one needs security, education, stability, predictability, transparency, the rule of law, and working institutions. The market development is driven, among other things, by the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and we can go into a long discussion what drives Belt and Road. Is it just the Chinese economic growth and extra industrial and financial capacity, or is it also a geopolitical agenda? I would argue from traveling in the region that the new generation, in order to meet the challenges of the 21st century, needs to be educated, open-minded, have languages, which is not always the case in all the countries, and be open to the economic and political challenges around the world. If you take a look at the report, you see that we talk about hard infrastructure, roads, railroads, airports, ports, something that, because Eurasia is so big, dry ports, like Khorgos on the border of China and Kazakhstan. We're talking about pipelines. There's some of them that I've written probably 12 or 15 years ago with my then colleague, Lisa Curtis, who is now at the National Security Council Senior Director for Asia. We wrote about TAPI. And TAPI is still a subject of feasibility studies, but the pipe is not laid down because of the security situation in Afghanistan. I would say that China is also has driven the demand for Central Asian natural resources, especially natural gas and oil. The dominant majority of projects are in one direction, west to east into China. I would say that access to ports, including Gwadar eventually in Pakistan on the Indian Ocean and other ports, is very important. And the big geopolitical challenge, to stay in a 60,000-foot picture, is how China and Russia are going to find common language or not in the next 10, 20, 30 years as Chinese economic and military power is growing, and Russia, we're not so sure. These two big powers are very important for the region, and we need to understand the concerns that governments in the region have trying to sleep between a bear and a dragon. Having said that, I think it's very important for the United States and the collective West, if the collective West still exists, to be involved. To be involved as an investor, to be involved with technical assistance, to be involved with a provider, as a provider of education. So please read our report, ask questions, send it around. It's available on the web. It's available hopefully here in hard copy. And again, thank you, Ambassador Herbst and the Atlantic Council, for providing us with the opportunity to present the report. Thank you very much.
Okay, Alir, thank you. Dick, you've been paying very close attention to Central Asia since you left the department, as you did in the department. Again, the most striking things in the region over the past 2 years have come from Tashkent. What do the changes in Uzbekistan mean for Uzbekistan and for the region?
Okay, first let me say thank you to Atlantic Council, Ambassador Herbst. Thank you, Ariel, for putting all this together. Ambassador, always an honor to be in the same room with you. To answer the question about changes in Uzbekistan, I have to tell you that I look at it from necessarily an outsider's point of view. I am not Uzbek. I wasn't born in the region. I don't have the history of the region. And also, I come at it from a U.S. perspective, and European too. But because I have been involved in Central Asia for 25 years during my career, I necessarily look at it in the way that the U.S. government has looked at the region, the way that the U.S. government has looked at Uzbekistan. So I'm going to make just a very few comments here, focusing mostly on the past, I think, but I'm doing that to show what a radical change is happening so we can look forward into the future and do things in a different way. So if I need to answer the question, how important are the changes in Uzbekistan? I would say they are absolutely of fundamental importance, not only for Uzbekistan, but for the entire region and beyond the region. I first got to know Uzbekistan when, as a young diplomat, I was assigned to Tashkent for 2 years in 1993. This was almost immediately after independence. And I fell in love with Uzbekistan and then with Central Asia. But it was a very different world at that time. And I'll tell you, it was a world that the US government simply did not understand at that time. We came at it with ideological expectations. Sometimes we joked a little bit later and said we had a little bit of irrational exuberance about what would happen. But we didn't realize how important the history was, and we didn't understand how the countries really worked among themselves. So we thought that there would be, naturally, Uzbekistan as the leader of the region because of its much larger, highly educated population, and because it was fairly well developed and industrialized. So naturally, it would become the leader. One of the fundamental mistakes of that early period, I believe, is that independent Uzbekistan didn't take on fundamental economic reforms so that its new currency and its independent new banking system could integrate into the world economy. And those economic problems continued to fester and fester. They discouraged significant growth and they discouraged international investment. Of course there was investment, but not to the degree that there could have been and that there was elsewhere in the region. I believe another significant problem was that the leadership in Tashkent at that time, early in independence, assumed that Uzbekistan already was and would continue to be the leading country in the region. I remember during the 1990s, the president of Uzbekistan at that time bragging that Uzbekistan was the natural and de facto leader of all the Turkic people, including into Western China. and that they should naturally look to Tashkent for leadership. He also offended many neighbors when he once made an offhand comment in public that the civilized Uzbeks had taught the backward nomads not to piss in their teapots. It was this kind of arrogance that began to isolate Uzbekistan. And as a result, Tashkent continued to assert its leadership, but it made little effort to cultivate relations with its neighbors. It didn't help that a feud quickly developed with Tajikistan and the civil war there and problems in Kyrgyzstan. But the region just could not come together. But it was so early in independence that it wasn't ready to come together at that time. So we shouldn't fault the countries, and specifically Uzbekistan, for that lack of cooperation. Because under the surface, there was cooperation, all the way back into the Soviet period and even before that. Another thing that held Uzbekistan back was that the leadership lacked the vision to understand the importance of educating for the future a new generation of leaders for both the public and private sectors. This is in stark contrast with Kazakhstan, frankly, that very early on established its Bolshak exchange program, scholarship program, to send very large numbers of its young people abroad for full university educations so that they could, during that time that they were away, internalize how the rest of the world works and then take those lessons home to build the new country. Okay, that all sounds very negative. Let's come into the present moment. Something that I find absolutely fascinating is that truly a revolution is now occurring in Uzbekistan, but without the disruption of being a color revolution. What is clear now is that from the beginning, there were highly placed people under the previous leadership who knew well what needed to be done, and to be done not just to keep Uzbekistan from falling further and further behind, but to move it forward as a key player in the region, to assume its natural leadership position. And that's now underway. It's especially heartening to watch President Mirziyoyev undertake long-delayed economic reforms, financial, currency, and banking, to show a new respect for human rights, to meet world standards, and increasingly to reach out to build positive relations with not just the other countries of Central Asia, but more broadly in the region. The reforms will need to continue, and they should be accelerated, but they're highly promising. I only wish I could be alive 25 years from now. I would love to go back to Tashkent and see what has happened during that 25 years. I think Uzbekistan will naturally assume its role as a leader in the region, working with the other countries productively. It will make the region a unified whole, and that's already beginning to happen. And I think we're in for watching great promise develop. Thank you.
Nick, thank you. That was very, very broad, insightful. Thomas, you've been involved in investment in business for a long time. How does Central Asia look today for foreign investment?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, and Ariel and the Atlantic Council for inviting me back to join this very distinguished panel, Your Excellency. So business, finance, and investment. I'd say on the surface, the signals are positive. Regional growth momentum has been strong and is getting stronger. Last year, GDP growth in the region doubled to 3.7% among both oil importers and exporters. This year, forecasts have been increased to 4%. FDI flows are and have been robust. Kazakhstan, which represents 3/4 of regional FDI, is on track to attract 24 billion this year, which is almost a record, puts it back into the peak level of 2011 to 2013. Public debt levels around the region are modest, ranging from 20% at the low end in Kazakhstan to just under 60% at the high end in the Kyrgyz Republic. External positions are strengthening thanks to rising commodity prices and also growing remittances. And then finally, benign international financial conditions have generally been supportive of emerging markets. So this has allowed sovereigns and sovereign-related entities to raise international capital for infrastructure investments. Tajikistan, for example, notably issued its debut Eurobond in September of last year, $500 million, in order to partially pay for the mega hydropower facility Rogun. That bond was 8 times oversubscribed, and that led to a tightening of almost 100 basis points in pricing. So a remarkable result. Also remarkable because the dam has been 40 years in the making and really should be an exemplar for an infrastructure project around the region. Internationally financed, an Italian contractor, and with an expectation that electricity will be exported through the region, south through Pakistan and Afghanistan. So all of this is good for bankers, printing loans and underwriting bonds. Also good for service providers, technology providers, General Electric selling trains, Boeing selling planes, GM automobiles. However, there is a disconnect between macro performance and the microeconomy from an investor's perspective. If we look at direct private sector investment into infrastructure, the picture is less rosy, I would argue, and there are some real challenges. Firstly, touching upon what Ariel mentioned earlier, institutional gaps are still wide. Contract enforcement, dispute resolution, governance generally, public trust in institutions. Progress is being made, evidenced by advancing global rankings around the region, whether it's World Bank Doing Business or WEF competitiveness ranking. However, the on-the-ground conditions don't frequently support project bankability. I would point to Shell's recent decision not to invest in KMG ahead of the IPO, and this is a particularly important issue for infrastructure projects, which, unlike commodities, are not fungible and are essentially long-term contracts with the state. Secondly, there is almost a growing trend of state involvement in regional economies. Some positive steps have been taken. Certainly, Kazakhstan's next wave of privatization is encouraging. Kazatomprom listed last month successfully. However, since the downturn in 2014, there have been some notable reversals. I would point, not to pick on KMG, but KMG's decision to acquire EP and delist from London. Kazakh Telecom at the moment is attempting to reacquire Kcell, which will give the company 65% of the cellular business, all of the fixed line, and 75% of broadband, etc. So thirdly and relatedly, that leads to a shortage of accessible and investable projects. It constrains the room for the private sector. Typically, infrastructure projects are agreed at a bilateral level. I would point to the recent announcement by the Emirates to enter Kazakhstan's aerospace, transport, and petrochemicals sectors, or they're executed in-house. So PPPs and private sector sources of capital are really just a rounding error in the state infrastructure program Nurli-Jol this year. So these on-the-ground conditions create an opportunity for Belt and Road, where projects come with less conditionality, fewer governance restrictions, are agreed at a G2G level, and create a channel for Chinese content and companies. So in summary, I would say the macro picture is bright and getting brighter. The micro picture is a bit more challenging.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that, but first I'd like to give Amelia a chance to describe how the Trump administration is looking at Central Asia today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I think this is on, right? So basically, when I read Ariel's report, I was fascinated, and as I noted to him, it was a lot of yes, yes, yes. I think that there's a real similarity of how we're looking at this region. Our regional strategy is focused on connectivity. So what we're looking at is getting the people, the businesses, and the countries to work in unison. We're pleased with the reforms that are going on, certainly in Uzbekistan, and not just we, but my colleague and I were in Tajikistan a few months ago, and the representatives of the Tajik government were saying to us, things have turned 180 degrees around, the borders are open, people are traveling. The Rogun Dam was able to move forward because of the cooperation and of the Uzbeks. So I think that in the region there is a moment, quite frankly, of a lot of optimism. We share that optimism. We also have our, reality is also influencing the way we look at the region. What the United States stresses with our Central Asian partners is that we are interested in their sovereignty, their independence, their territorial integrity. And honestly, these are the three factors that really underpin all of our engagements with the region. From our perspective, from the US government perspective, a lot of progress is being made. We think in part because of what's going on in Uzbekistan. We think that the elections recently as well in the Kyrgyz Republic have brought to power somebody who is more westward, Western leaning in terms of being open to engage with us, being open to engage with the United States. And what we're also seeing is when you look at the administration's South Asia strategy, we see a very large role for Central Asia in the South Asia strategy. So the South Asia strategy's primary focus is a negotiated peace in Afghanistan. But obviously, countries need their neighbors. Countries need the support of their neighbors. We had Ambassador Vakabov, as well as his counterparts from the Central Asian countries, to the State Department about 2 weeks ago to talk about our view of what is going on in Afghanistan. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan were extremely forward-leaning in their willingness to help, to be a venue for negotiations. As you mentioned, Mr. Ambassador, Ambassador Khalilzad will be heading to your country, heading to Turkmenistan as well, to engage with your governments about the roles that they can play. What we see is having Afghanistan knit back in to Central Asia, or kind of working together with them, will benefit Afghanistan, will also in many ways benefit Central Asia. You mentioned the TAPI pipeline, and that is something that we are looking at. The Rogun Dam as well. These countries have a lot of energy, have a lot of potential, and are looking for new markets. And we also are supporting the Central Asia regional electricity market. We are hoping that the 5 Central Asian countries will sign on to this. It's an agreement, but it's a non-binding agreement to work together. CASA 1000, I always call it CASA 100, but it's CASA 1000, is also a way to get Central Asia, South Asia linked up in their electricity and energy markets. You've got countries like Pakistan, countries like Afghanistan that need additional energy, and you've got Central Asian, countries that are very likely to be able to produce a surplus of energy in the coming years. Now, what Secretary Pompeo said in his July 30th remarks when he was talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, Central Asia is not part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think that some of his comments really do pertain to Central Asia, particularly when we are talking about whether we call it OBOR or BRI. So what the Secretary said was, we are looking for an open and free Indo-Pacific. we are not trying to exclude any partners. Certainly, for we don't have the resources to fund, like every project that needs to be done. In terms of the Indo-Pacific, I think it was something like $27 trillion are going to be needed in the next couple of years. No government can fund that. So what the Secretary conveyed was, the private sector are the ones with those deep pockets, but in order to attract the good private sector, you need to put into place some of the regulatory basis that will attract those private sector. You need to have free, open, transparent regulations. You need to have court systems that are functioning. You need to know that contracts are going to be upheld, and if they are not, that there is recourse to a true, open and fair judiciary. So those are the types of actions that the U.S. government is working on, whether it's through the Department of Justice, Department of Treasury, USAID. We've invested billions of dollars in the region since independence in terms of assistance. And I think that it takes time. So we are starting to, I believe, see some of the fruits of that, and some of the institutions that are really getting their legs underneath them and that are going to be able to support this opening up of the economy, this development of the economy. There are still issues that we are dealing with. We're dealing with human rights, we're dealing with labor, we're dealing with religious freedom, we're dealing with media, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. But we're not looking at those in isolation. What we're trying to do is say, okay, we've got this partnership, and I have led 2 delegations, one to Turkmenistan, one to Tajikistan recently, where we have annual bilateral consultations. Actually, they weren't annual for a while. It was the first time we had held them for a number of years in both Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. But it was an opportunity for us to sit down, assess where we are in the relationship, and assess what needs to be done for the relationship to continue and to deepen, to strengthen those relationships. So we see this moment as opportunity, certainly in Uzbekistan. I was talking today with our USAID director in Uzbekistan, and basically we said, okay, this seems to be, the country that's getting all the love, all the attention right now. Do they have the absorptive capacity if they're getting not just, I'm not talking about just US, but EU, British, other, Japan, everybody's interested in getting into Uzbekistan. And what I heard from our USAID director was, yes, absolutely. This is a country that is poised to really launch, to take off. And it's an opportunity for us to get in there with the other donors. Obviously, we don't want to be treading all over each other's toes, but with the types of assistance in terms of, having people embedded in ministries. Here's how you put out a tender. Here's how you ensure that it's open and transparent. Here's how you advertise these things. Here's how you focus on the follow through for tenders for these programs. So again, everybody's interested in the region. I think that it is an area that I have fallen madly in love with Central Asia over the past, 6 months. And I think that the energy is palpable when you get there. One other thing when you're talking about the not hard, the soft infrastructure, the other item that I will mention, and I will stop here, is that there's tremendous interest in English language acquisition. Kazakhstan wants to be a trilingual country. They want to have English, Russian, and Kazakh. We spoke with the Minister of Education from Uzbekistan several months ago. They too, the Uzbeks, are very interested in reorganizing their Ministry of Education and the instruction to their students. They want to make sure that students have access to English instruction. Again, they're seeing that this will open doors for their own young people and really assist them in moving forward. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Amelia. This has been a treat because, in effect, you've heard, not in debate style, but with reasonable civil conversation, 2 very different visions for Central Asia and, for that matter, for development there. I want to explore this a little bit. Katalis mentioned that the macroeconomic environment is very favorable, and that the circumstances there, which are not so favorable for foreign direct investment, for private investment, is a kind of advantage for China and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Then you heard Amelia lay out a vision for the region, very much focusing on those institutions which are necessary to promote foreign direct investment. So first, my question for Katolis. Can there be serious, prolonged growth without the institutions that Amelia advocates that foreign investors want?
Well, I mean, I think without the institutional fabric, you're trading short-term gains
That's why I said long-term.
for long-term decline or long-term constraint. So yes, I don't think there is an example of a country that has grown at its potential long-term without a deep, rich institutional fabric.
Okay, that's a very cautious answer. Now, so I'll ask the question, which might be harder for you to answer, to Amelia. Does this mean, in your judgment, that in effect the Chinese initiative, which looks very attractive to cash-starved, to investment-starved countries, will actually mean slower growth in the medium and long term?
I would not, okay, I'm going to answer from the policy perspective. The policy perspective is there are opportunities for a lot of players in Central Asia. The countries of Central Asia will determine where they get their loans, who they borrow from, the types of projects. We are not asking any country to make it an either-or decision. You don't have to choose the United States and not China, or Russia and not China, or China and not whatever. The countries will decide for themselves. That said, there are some concerns about the terms of some of these loans, the ability of some countries to pay them back. Mm-hmm. We are seeing instances in Sri Lanka where you've got a country that has become, really just inundated with a loan, and they're, now not in control of one of their ports. And frankly, in Tajikistan, there have been some issues with, I think their foreign debt is, 50%? It's 60% is owed to China?
That's the Kyrgyz Republic.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking.
In Tajikistan is around 50%, and
around
the bulk of that, 90% of that is to China.
Yeah. So, you have to look at what the Secretary advocated for was what you want to do is make sure that when you're investing in infrastructure that it is good for your country and that it is good for your people, so that you don't want to be building infrastructure that is not going to have a long-term utility in your country, and you certainly don't want to build infrastructure that is going to crush your government under unsustainable debt loads. Beyond that, each country will decide for itself which direction it will go in.
That was a skillful diplomatic answer right around my question. Ariel, you're no diplomat, but besides being a geopolitician, in other words, someone who writes on geostrategy, you also have been an advisor for investors. Yeah. So your take on the circumstances for strong, sustained development in Central Asia. Is this something which One Belt, One Road can provide? Is this part of the solution? Is this something which is as suggested, but I'm not putting these words into your mouth, Katolis, I realize you have to work in the business world, could be good in the short run, but not so good in the long run?
The quick answer to your question, John, and it's a very important and valid question.
Maybe too provocative.
No.
Okay.
Is looking at the merits of each project and figuring out how the project is going to pay for itself, looking at the timeline of the project, looking whether this project is short-term, medium-term, long-term, what are the interest rates, and what are the rates of return. Probably rates of return is the key characteristic here. And yes, some of these projects are very long-term. You take a power station, you take an airport. These are long-term profitability you're looking at. And yes, without reasonably good infrastructure, an area or a country is not very attractive. Those of us who travel in the region remember how the region used to be at independence, know what kind of advancement countries like Kazakhstan accomplished with new gleaming infrastructure, managing the national debt, having an advantage of oil and gas and natural resources revenue, but also moving forward with projects that add value beyond natural resources. Just an example, Astana International Financial Center is a transition from a 20th century natural resources-based proposition to a 21st century investment and financial services added value proposition. Katulis mentioned they floated Kazatomprom, they float other companies, they will float Kazmunaygas, the national oil and gas champion, Air Astana, Kaz Telecom, and we'll see. And another thing they're doing is, of course, providing litigation and arbitration services. Again, this is not oil and gas. This is what advanced economies do. Right. Can everybody have an international financial hub? Probably not. But hopefully each country will look for and find new, more advanced ways to make money, to add value beyond the natural resources. Yes, there is a danger of indebting the nation too much. And I'm not picking who are the holders of the debt. And I'm not picking who are those geopolitical actors who want to dictate their terms, who want to say, you can play in this sandbox, but not in that sandbox. I think it defeats the purpose of what we're discussing, which is economic development, social development, education, and provision of human services, that there's a long way to go in health, in education, in social safety net, in fighting drugs, fighting corruption, and developing the rule of law.
Okay.
Was that diplomatic enough?
I don't want to beat this dead Bactrian camel any further. So let's turn to the audience, see what questions they have. Okay, in the back, and then look at you over here.
Sure. Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in Washington. Dr. Cohen, you just talked about the Astana International Financial Center. I think I heard that Goldman Sachs actually bought around 4.1% of the shares of the stock exchange of International Center, and I learned that actually English is the lingua franca that's spoken at the AIFC, and they have.
Who spoke?
Oh, the English is the language that's used at the AIFC, yes. And they have also adopted English common law. Yes. I was wondering, so it seems like the Kazakh government is really trying to attract Western investment, U.S. investment, Japanese investment. Do you think that it's going to work long term? Thank you.
As I just said, they floated one national champion, and they floated a little portion of it. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about
15%.
15%. Right? There's a long way to go with other big Kazakh companies. And hopefully they have, for example, as a part of the Astana International Financial Center, there's Islamic finance that Gulf players are interested in. I was at the opening, and they put me on TV with a Pakistani expert who is running the Abu Dhabi Islamic finance. So they will try to diversify, have project financing, have litigation, as I mentioned, and arbitration. Yes, in English. Yes, with the English law, and actually with real-life English judges, including the former Chief Justice Lord of Great Britain, Lord Wolf. So that is a high quality expertise that is being imported to Kazakhstan. And there's no news here. There were Germans and Dutch and the Brits and the French running all over the Russian Empire when after Peter the Great started moving the Russian Empire towards the Western orientation. Unfortunately, today, you go to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and 300 years after Peter the Great, they say, we're not part of the West. Well, you could fool me. If I looked at the architecture of St. Petersburg, it definitely looked like part of the West. The Meiji Restoration in Japan, the great strides China made, this is all importing ideas, people, technology, norms, regulation and laws from whatever the advanced economies of the time are, including the United States. So I think it may succeed, to answer your question, provided it will not be limited just to Kazakhstan. I'm not sure, Katulis knows more about it than I do. Can just the Kazakh capital market, which is not huge, the other stock exchange in Almaty is $42 billion, general capitalization. Can Kazakhstan alone support it, or it will need a role beyond the national borders and maybe even beyond the region?
Well, to answer that, first, I recognize as the advisor to the CEO of the AIFC in the back row there. So I see he's listening very intently to our conversation. I would argue that AIFC and the AIX has already been a success. And I think it really depends on how you define success. If you define success as the next London Stock Exchange, well, I don't think your definition is realistic. If you define success as a haven, as a bellwether and a benchmark for the rule of law, institutions, the business environment, then I think the AIFC has achieved success. I see it almost as a, without any pejorative context, a Trojan horse for further reforms of the business environment in Kazakhstan and a beacon for the region. Attracting regional capital, listing new companies, small and medium-sized enterprises. This is not a 12 to 24 month time frame. This is a long-term development time frame. And I think it's so incredibly important, and a testament to what the Kazakhs and the AIFC have done is that they've said, we will do the institutions first. We'll build the soft infrastructure first, and then we'll roll out a few of the key IPOs. But this is not chasing capital for capital's sake. So I take a slightly different view. I think that the AIFC has already been a success.
Okay, question over here, and then over there.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the great panel. I'm Ruhollah Osmani from Asian Development Bank, based in Washington, and also a visiting scholar with Hopkins ICE. With reference to infrastructure, as you know, ADB is investing a lot there through GAREC. Thanks, Ambassador of Uzbekistan, for mentioning that. But per another report, I haven't read this report, look forward to reading it. There is a need of, to keep the sustainable growth in Asia, there is a need of $1.7 trillion infrastructure in Asia, which goes back to who will pay for that amount. All together, international financial institution, other, and government will not meet 10% of that investment amount. So the question is, what would be the recommendation if you were to recommend the Central Asian government here in terms of attracting the private sector investment? There are a couple of things that mentioned, but it was also mentioned that the growing role of government in the market. How you see that impacting negatively in terms of attracting private sector, and what would be your recommendation on that?
Okay. Wants to take a shot at that? Please.
I would start with a dialogue between the international financial institutions and other governments, including China, Russia, US, EU. The dialogue about how transparent these projects should be, how these governments need to be aware that there is no place for corruption, there's no place for bending the criteria that are clear to the investors. And what I said before, looking at the realistic rates of return, not fake rates of return that these projects will provide. And if this is something that the government is pursuing because of public good, a road, a hospital, or whatever that is, then everybody needs to understand that the government took out a loan and going to repay this loan to an international financial institution over 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. What I think defeats the projects and gives bad name to involvement of international financial institutions and to the way the governments present themselves is when you see what in the business is called the white elephants, something that was launched, the financing ran out, it was abandoned, then somebody takes $1 billion and disappears. I was advising on the case in the Persian Gulf recently of a government-run institution that just lost its CEO, who absconded with $1 billion, and people are looking for him. This needs to be avoided at all costs, and I will not point fingers in the region, but it is the transparency and the rule of law and building the soft infrastructure we talked about. Not just passing a law, quality of legislation and quality of the supporting, implementing regulation, and quality of enforcement, quality of courts. And you and I know that ordinary business people going to ordinary courts, not to the British Chief Justice Lord, but to an ordinary court in Shymkent or in Osh or even in Tashkent and Astana, they cannot always count on impartiality and, frankly, as speaking of the former lawyer, professionalism of that judge. And that is a huge challenge. And I'm glad that Kazakhstan invested in quality of their civil service. Bolashak was mentioned here. Thousands of people trained abroad, came back. Georgia is another example. Good leap forward in terms of quality of personnel. But the reality is a reality. These are multi-generational changes, by the way. We would be, as much as I cheer for Uzbekistan, I'm almost 60 years old. I'm not telling myself stories that in 3 years Uzbekistan is going to be like Switzerland. These are multi-generational changes. I'm impressed with what President Nazarbayev is doing in terms of education, in terms of high level of some of the universities there, in terms of Bolashak, we already mentioned. But without the human capital, it's not going to really succeed on the level of OECD. Kazakhstan is talking about joining OECD, I think, in 2050.
They don't get to choose.
What's that?
It's the.
No, but that's
there is
an aspirational goal. Okay.
Yeah,
So
it depends on the OECD. Sure.
Of course. But in order to move in that direction, you have to invest in your human capital.
So 2 little suggestions that are beyond the obvious privatize and continue with your structural reforms. I personally think that multilaterals have and continue to play an enormously important role in advancing the grassroots governance changes that we've been talking about. However, as a private sector participant, I'm also very aware of multilaterals' disadvantages. Number 1, timing. Partial credit risk guarantee, 2 years at best. A loan, even if it's a minority stake, 12 months if things are going well. So for governments in these parts of the world that are looking for capital for difficult projects where the private sector can't necessarily find the right modality, Belt and Road offers a quick opportunity. I therefore think that it is, some of the onus is on multilaterals to do some soul searching and to look at potentially internal reforms, to respond faster and more according to the needs of the governments, to better position themselves as an alternative, number one. Number two, I'm doing quite a lot of work in Latin America at the moment, where US Treasury and DOE have launched a new initiative called America Crece, which means the Americas grow, which is essentially a very high-level strategic dialogue and engagement with the countries of Latin America to better level the competitive playing field for US companies, to promote exports of US energy infrastructure, and all of the capital markets financing that goes along with it. I would really suggest that a similar approach, maybe not the same initiative, but a similar approach in Central Asia, strategic high-level dialogue led by Treasury, State Department, DOE, focusing on infrastructure, that creates a channel for private sector investigation, study. Central Asia is a long way away from the United States. Business links are difficult from time to time. So a similar approach. I think it's a case of just throwing a light on the region within the administration, and that high-level dialogue tends to move things along quickly. So my two little suggestions.
Can I ask Emilia? Emilia,
Yeah.
is there something like that also
Here.
vis-a-vis Africa? Because what Catullus described, this is a uniform prescription for any developing region that we should have.
I cannot answer to Africa. I apologize, but I can get the answer for you. In terms of Central Asia, though, a couple of things. One item that I would add that kind of goes along, intellectual property rights. I think that is also crucial. That's something that we talk to our partner governments about all the time. Unless you are not only instituting laws by which you say, oh yeah, we're not going to steal IPR, but you actually implement those laws, and that is another step. In terms of shining a light, we certainly have instituted what we're calling the C5+1. This is 3 years old at this point, and so that was a kind of an impetus to get all 5 Central Asian countries together with the United States and to work collaboratively on projects together. Now, right now we're working on CASA 1000, Karam might go in there. We're working on some security programs with the USIP, US Institute of Peace. So there is a focal point in our engagement. The ABCs, as we call them, the annual bilateral consultations, is another opportunity. We did have members from DOJ, from DOD who came with us, from Treasury was there as well, or just EB?
Just EB.
EB.
Treasury has been invited to our next set with
Okay. Alice Wells, who's the senior bureau official for SCA, that's her title, or
That's the jargon.
PDES, that's our jargon, yeah. She will be heading to Kazakhstan next week, again, with Treasury, where the governments will discuss very far-reaching, the whole panoply of issues that are on the table. Because we are not, obviously an economy that directs our private enterprises are private, we can't direct them. But we had Secretary Ross in the region in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan a couple of weeks ago with 16 private businesses. The TIFA, which stands for
Trade and Investment Framework.
God bless you, Courtney. Thank you. They were there, and that's an opportunity for the countries of the region to get together to talk about how they can really make themselves more attractive. And we had a USAID program, Central Asian Trade Forum, where they brought companies to the region as well. So what the US government can do is be a facilitator, shine a light on the region, and get businesses to come out there. Certainly commerce is engaged with this. And then it is up to, to the companies themselves to do speed dating and to decide, like, where am I going to invest? Where do I want my money to go? Another issue that we have been stressing is, if you're a country like the Kyrgyz Republic and you've got like fewer than 6 million people, that's a long way to go for a US company. But if the interconnectedness within the region is such that I can set up shop in Bishkek, but do business across the region, then you have really exponentially grown your market there. And if you have those connections, let's say to Afghanistan, to China, to Russia, all the more attractive for U.S. businesses. So opportunities, and we try to shine that light on it and try to bring the businesses out. But then it's up to the countries and the businesses to play ball. So,
Dick, do you want to say something?
I do. I've been listening very intently here, and I keep hearing again and again and answering in various ways two things that come up. Change is multi-generational. We can have all the most wonderful policies in the world that we chatter about and we say that we are supporting, and we do support. But change is multi-generational. It doesn't come overnight. And then it is essential, as we've heard again and again in different ways on this panel, to build institutions so that things work the way they're supposed to work for everyone. Now, look, we're talking about countries in a part of the world that have a radical different history than we have. These are countries that for 70 years under the Soviet Empire and then 100 plus years under the Russian Empire were absolutely separated from the West. And what we're talking about now are pretty much Western values that we assume are global values. But as China's teaching us, they aren't necessarily, even though we believe in them, and they do work for us. But if you look at how during that 70-year empire and then the 100 years plus before that, how were the governments organized? It wasn't according to the rationality of the West. It was a politician, whether it's a czar and now maybe single party, the intelligence services to make it work, and collusion with the mafia, which is now more and more respectable oligarchs. But that's how governments are organized. I well remember as a diplomat, as an ambassador, when I was given talking points to go into governments and lecture them about corruption. I would think, oh boy, because we have a certain problem with that too. So how I would change those talking points would be to say, look, we in the United States, we are corrupt too. And I would give a few examples of high-level officials, whether they were mayors or governors or Congress people. I'd say, but the difference is we draw a line. And it's not that we support corruption beneath that line, but when it crosses the line, then we have rule of law. And that means that people go to prison for the most part. This is still very, very, very new in this part of the world. So I'd say, again, the most important thing for development for the longer term is to bring corruption under control and institutionalize reform and those economic forces that give more or less a level playing field, not only for international investors, but for the people of the region.
Okay, question over here.
Kathy Kosman. I have a question about the human dimension in the following way. How is it that the Chinese, who have imprisoned, 1 million Uyghurs and 200,000 Kazakhs and possibly 200,000 Kyrgyz, I'm not too sure on the Kazakh-Kyrgyz figures, and this is on the eve of the Belt and Road Initiative, about which we've heard so much positive information just now and read about it in the press, and yet, as we all know very well, Central Asia is a Muslim majority area, and the Uyghurs and obviously the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs are too. So where do we go from here? And I'd like to hear Ambassador Hoagland on this issue, among other people. Thank you.
This, once again, is one of those issues that I was always uncomfortable with how we presented to our partners in Central Asia, specifically the issue of human rights. And sometimes I got a bad reputation here in Washington for not supporting human rights enough. No, it's not that. It's how you introduce this issue and then how you actually get results. What has happened in the not too distant past for 10 years until this administration is different in a different way. We fell more and more into the habit of naming and shaming and finger wagging in public. And then once we would do that, we say, okay, we've done our job. No, we didn't do our job. What we did was offend people we were trying to help, and we harmed those who were already victims. There's certain times when we could go behind closed doors and sit down with senior officials in these countries and say, look, here are the facts in this case. We understand that you have certain interests here, but you are harming yourself in the longer term by what you are doing in this specific case. By and large, we could get results. So yes, absolutely, the United States supports human rights and all the other values that go along with that, but we have to learn to be smart in how we try to implement it, I think.
In terms of the Uyghurs, this is an issue that we engage on regularly with governments in the region. Certainly, we say that, refoulement, you cannot send people back who are going to be in danger. But as Ambassador Hoagland just said, oftentimes we do this directly in diplomatic dialogue with government officials and not in the press. But it is of tremendous concern what we're hearing about what is happening to the Uyghur population, and we are engaging on it.
What strikes me in this particular case is almost a deafening silence from the major Muslim countries. You will be inundated with concerns about Rohingya, which was horrible what happened there. Concerns about Palestinians, Islamophobia in Europe, Islamophobia in this country. You do not hear very much, not from the Islamic Republic of Iran, not from our Saudi partners, and not from others about the Uyghurs. And that raises a question, why is it? And the example I can bring you is from Henry Kissinger's book about the Cold War. Kissinger, in The Diplomacy, his magisterial book, says, when you go to a third world country that is very vehement in its criticism of the United States, you don't hear the same criticism of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union can damage you more. You don't hear the criticism of the People's Republic, because People's Republic can really mess with you if you do. And that's food for thought.
I would expand on Ariel's point. It's true that we've not heard much from the Islamic world, whether we're talking about Central Asia, whether we're talking about the Arab world, whether we're talking about the Organization of Islamic Conference. What's equally interesting, and actually more surprising, because this phenomenon in the Islamic world we've seen before, is largely the failure of the media in the West, which in theory should be deeply interested in this. I don't have a good explanation for that. I know that the chances of the US government working quietly on this issue, the chances of success go way down if there's not serious public attention. I worked the human rights side of the street when I was in the State Department too. And I thought that having reasonable goals for human rights objectives was a sensible policy because it was achievable. But you know, when I worked in Tashkent, Uzbekistan had a very bad reputation. In fact, the reputation was worse than reality. And I criticized Human Rights Watch for talking about peaceful Muslims as a category, which was actually disingenuous. But point of fact, at that time in Tashkent, we figured there were about 7,000 political prisoners. They were political prisoners, but most of them were extremist Muslims. So they weren't arbitrarily picked up the street. But that number, which created great condemnation, is a fraction of the numbers who are currently incarcerated in China. And there's really no outrage that I can see. So where are the human rights organizations? Where are the major media? This is a very important question. Mm-hmm. And I hope we here at the Atlantic Council will address it sometime early next year. Stay tuned. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank our panel. And we hope to do more work on Central Asia.